listening to Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs, a show that discusses internal and relational anxiety, how it blocks effective leadership, and how we can move through it to a greater health. And now your host, Steve Cuss.
All right, folks, let's get right to it. Today's guest is Mandy Smith. Mandy is a fellow Aussie, but also the lead pastor of University Christian Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. University Christian is an amazing church with an urban emphasis, as well as having a significant outreach to students at the University of Cincinnati. Mandy is also the author of multiple books, including her leadership book called The Vulnerable Pastor. I've read it. It's fantastic. It's a great book for any number of people to figure out how to continue to serve and lead in a public and open way. I began just right off the bat by asking Mandy how she deals with feelings of inadequacy.
Oh boy, let's just start with something simple. So how do I deal with feelings of inadequacy? I have a friend who described it in a really wonderful and helpful way, that he said, when we have moments of just sensing we're in it over our head, we can understand that as an invitation into anxiety, and it kind of devolves into anxiety, or it's also an opportunity for reverence and worship. And so it's a really good and a normal human experience to sense that something is bigger than us, or something is beyond our capacity, and that actually can be a moment to say, oh my God, I need you right now. Or it can be an opportunity to be like, this is, to spiral downwards into despair and anxiety. And so in a way, that should be the moment of, in a way, the spiraling downwards is an atheist choice. It's bad theology, really, because we would claim to say that God is here for every way that we are inadequate, and this is an opportunity to just turn to him one more time. But our culture is so deeply embedded in us and tells us, if you feel inadequate, it's your job to work harder, fix it, get another degree, buy a product, somehow put on a facade. And so I don't always recognize that response in myself, but the more that I do, the better I am, and the more those opportunities, those moments that are opportunities to reach out to the Lord. And I think that goes back to the core of our sin, really. That's the core of what happened in the garden. So it's nothing small.
So what was it like when you first started lead pastoring, the first 2 or 3 years? What kind of inadequacy rose to the surface in you?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's the normal human inadequacy that we all feel of being in a situation that's new to us. And then there's this kind of vague cloud of just not feeling like you've ever seen anybody like you do it before. And also this less vague cloud of voices over your shoulder who are saying, you probably shouldn't be doing this, and every time that you make a mistake or that you fail or you feel inadequate, it's a sign that you shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, and by voices, you're not saying
I mean real people.
Yeah, not imaginary voices in your
right.
head.
Some of them I know, some of them just find me on social media.
All right, so 6 years in, what are you at peace with now that you weren't at peace with when you started?
Oh boy. I guess I'm not entirely at peace with this, but I can see myself going in a more peaceful direction, that truly in our weakness God is strong, that I'm a perfectionist, and in the beginning one of my biggest anxieties was, what if I make a mistake? It's going to be really public. And the possibility that his grace is sufficient is becoming more and more a reality to me, that even in the ways that I have made mistakes, somehow his power has been seen. And it's not always in the way I would have preferred it. But I was just thinking, actually, I led a Bible study this morning, and I was remembering that early on I felt a lot of pressure to fill the space in the room. And if there was ever a silence, I took that as, oh, they're not enjoying this, or I'm not good at this. And just for some reason remembered that, and today realized how much silence there was in the room, and how much I didn't take it personally. I just trusted it's not my job to fill them. It's my job to direct them towards the one who fills them. And to trust that power really is at work, and it's just my job to help people direct their attention to it. It's not my job to be powerful.
You've spoken publicly about your inner world, a world that includes, among other things, depression and anxiety. How have you come to embrace those as gifts for leadership?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm always careful to say when I talk about this too that the whole God can be strong in our weakness message can also be misinterpreted that we should never stop to take a break. You know, if God can be strong in my weakness, then when I'm depressed, I just need to power through because God can be strong in that. But there are seasons, if God can be strong in our weakness, that he can carry the church so that we can step out for a while. And so depression especially is the kind of thing that sometimes you just need a break. At the same time, there are many seasons where I have to discern, okay, is this bad enough that I need to step back, or I just need to trust that God is strong? And I think that depression and anxiety are kind of two sides of the same coin often. And so anxiety is always an issue that I'm tempted towards. I think that learning to recognize it, as I mentioned at the beginning, learning to recognize it as an invitation to just say to the Lord, I need you. And it becomes, instead of something that drives me away from God to just go and stew on my own anxiety, I can turn to him and say, I need you. And suddenly it's an opportunity to grow in my relationship with him. So it does have that interesting kind of hidden potential. Depression often for me comes from overwork and taking more responsibility on myself than I should. And so oftentimes depression I see as an invitation into rest, which doesn't always mean stepping away entirely from work. But it's a kind of a strange metaphor, but I've come to see it almost in the same way as any female mammal, any female creature, when they're sick or something, or there's a drought or something, and it's just not a good time to reproduce, the female's body just stops having a cycle. It's just, there's not a time to be flourishing or to be reproducing right now. It's a time to just attend to your own needs. And I think that depression can be like that as well, that it's not a time to be productive. It's not a time to be anxious and give yourself a hard time and shame yourself for being tired or needing rest. And so I've learned to trust that I don't want to wallow in the depression, but I also and trusting that God has set something in our hearts that just certain functions shut down, and emotional functions even shut down in order to attend to, your heart is just tired, just like your brain gets tired. If you've been doing math problems all day long, you wouldn't be surprised if your brain is tired of doing math problems and you'd go and watch Netflix for a bit or something. Our heart gets tired as well of carrying things. And but sometimes when we notice that we're depressed, we put more pressure on our heart to be like, figure out why you're depressed, stop being so depressed. And so we add this extra anxiety, which is not the energy that we need at the time. We need to so I've tried to set aside there's the reality of what you're actually dealing with right now. And then there's this part of you that's kind of separate from that and watching that and saying, you shouldn't be feeling this right now, or I'm anxious that how long is this going to take? I've got things I need to do and people relying on me. And I've tried to just kind of shut that voice up and just be in the reality of what is, and trust that God has put processes in place that if we just rest and let that process unfold, it brings me through every time. And the times that I get anxious about my depression or shame myself for my depression or just like want to rush it, it actually cuts off that natural process that God has put in place. And interestingly, I remember being in my kitchen one morning when I was depressed. And usually for me, I'll say this and then I'll finish this answer. It's a long answer. Usually for me, depression feels like I'm the critic of the movie of my life instead of just an actor in the movie. I'm kind of hovering above it and analyzing everything. And I've heard a lot of people say something similar to that, where you're not just in your daily life, you're thinking about your life constantly. And one morning, it was early in the morning, and I was waiting to say goodbye to my kids, and I was standing in the kitchen with their lunch boxes in my hands, and they were still putting on their shoes or whatever. And I just picked up a book I was reading for book club, and it was this interesting journal kind of format, and it said, I'm sitting in a cafe and there's a purple flower on the table next to me, and I just got my hair cut and I think it's a bit too short. What's happening right now in your life? And I just almost felt this noise of me kind of coming back down into my own skin, like, And I was like, I'm standing in the kitchen in my pajamas, and I'm really thankful actually that I have food to offer my children to send them off to school. And actually, I kind of need to go to the bathroom. So I went and did that. And it was just a moment of like being really present. And so I found it's very humbling, and it goes against everything you want to do in depression, which is like, if I just think my way, I'm just going to think my way through this, which just adds to this like over anxiety, overthinking everything. Instead, I'll choose to just really taste the food when I'm eating it, really like feel the shower when I'm having it, really like feel the blankets when I'm going to bed, and to just be present in my body and let my senses be alive. Somehow it comes around like the back way. And after a couple of weeks of that, I find myself just being grateful again. And I don't force gratefulness. I just choose attentiveness to my senses. Somehow it just helps me be okay with being a human being again.
I think way more leaders than people realize struggle with anxiety and or depression, or certainly have an inner life that they really struggle to figure out how to share appropriately. And, you wrote The Vulnerable Pastor. It's an incredible book that really, if I understand what you were saying in that book, Mandy, you're basically inviting a pastor to be fully aware of just how human you are, and how sharing that humanity is a gift in leadership, it's not an obstacle. I don't know what the question is in there, but what's your reaction to that?
I love that you say that, because I think when they chose to use the word vulnerable in the title, people assume that I'm talking about it the way that Brené Brown does. And there is definitely overlap, and I love what she does. Vulnerability, what I think about it is exactly what you said, that it's about just the ordinary experience of being a limited human being. And in a way, I think I come at that as an artist does, that artists are always thinking about the human condition, or as a philosopher does. Kierkegaard is often wrestling with this reality. And so, and the Bible is too. Like, is it okay for us to not always understand or not know how to fix all the problems in life, or for our hearts to just be broken sometimes? And if we believe what the world tells us, which is that that's a problem for us to feel that humanness, then we're not really going to bring our whole selves to this work or to the Lord. And we're going to miss so many opportunities, because it's other limited human beings that we're supposed to be ministering with and to. So I love that you describe it in that way. And one of the most vulnerable things about it is that there's not an easy formula. Sometimes when I go to speak about this and they say, but if you really let yourself be seen, what if people don't get it? Or what if it backfires? Or what if they use that against you? And there definitely are ways to be thoughtful. There's a wonderful passage that says, Jesus did not entrust himself to them, for he knew what was in the heart of men. And so there is biblical precedent for being wise and cautious. And I've learned that the hard way. I used to think Jesus was just let everybody know all your secrets all the time, and that's not going to be good for them or for you. And so I am always discerning, what is my reason for holding back, or what is my reason for sharing? And in both cases, how can I serve other people in how I choose whether to hold back or whether to share? And that's in speaking, but also just in letting people see you in certain stages of life. If a congregant comes and knocks on your door when you've just had an argument with your spouse, you're put in a tricky situation right there. And will you let them actually see that in some way, as much as it's appropriate? Because you also have your spouse's interest to think about. I'm naturally a very emotional person. I mean, we're all very emotional people, and I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about that because, anxiety and anger are no less emotional than tears.
Yeah, I would say that I think what you are is you are very in touch with your emotions and very comfortable feeling them.
I'm also kind of just knocked off my feet by them sometimes. And
Okay.
A lot of emotions look like tears for me. So anger often will come out in tears. Frustration comes out as tears. And people often assume I've just got my feelings hurt all the time, but it's a lot of different things come out that way. And so that is one of the hardest things in my life, because I also know all of the stereotypes about women being emotional. And if given a choice, I would just set that aside. And I sometimes feel myself making a choice because I could be a really distant person. And there was the time, one of the things I did in high school when I felt this vulnerability of my own sensitivity was to just kind of be an ice queen. And I remember even as a child, this interesting moment that I was aware of even as a kid. And I thought, that's interesting. I wonder why I did that. One day, my cat would always bring birds that it would catch, and it brought a bird on our front porch, and I nursed the bird all day, tried to make it safe and take care of it, and I just put so much of my heart into that bird, and it dropped dead at the end of the day. And about a week later, my cat brought another bird up on the porch, and I just walked straight past. And so I feel myself discerning often. There's plenty of broken birds that come on our porch as pastors, and sometimes we have the option to just walk straight past. And I could probably be a fairly effective, efficient pastor. I get a lot of stuff done. I don't know if it would be a very transformative way of leading, because I wouldn't actually let myself be seen. I would just be telling them information, and that can work, but there would be a certain level at which my heart and my engagement with God would not be exposed to them, and I wouldn't be inviting them into something. And so I'm always wrestling with the Lord, because I feel Him always pressing me to say what is on my heart and what He's doing in my life. I'm not over the discomfort. I'm getting used to the discomfort. I think we'll always be uncomfortable with our own weakness or limitation, but there's this kind of crazy freedom and even humor that comes for me, where I'm like, this is so ridiculous what I feel called to do. I know it's so far beyond me. It's as ridiculous as getting a little boy to slay a giant, God lets the smallness of David be seen so that his power is obvious. So that there's this miraculous moment where you're like, well, obviously something else is at work here, because that person couldn't have done that, and so we have to let that be seen, but in a way that is just trusting that God is the one who's working here. And when we do that, it doesn't become like a pity party or whatever. But also, similarly with doubting God, one of the biggest stretches for me has been feeling a call to pray for healing for people, which is not something that I grew up doing. It's not common in my tradition. And really learning a lot from Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane, where he says, Father, all things are possible, which is a beautiful way to start any prayer. And then he says, take this cup from me. I want this. Is it okay for me? It's one of the hardest things for us to do in prayer, to actually come out and say what we actually want.
It's actually, I would say, one of the hardest things to do in life.
Yes.
Just to name, here's what I want.
Yes, because we're worried we'll be disappointed, and if we get our hopes up. I mean, it was like me with the bird. I wanted the bird to live, and the bird didn't live, and I was disappointed. And so I stopped looking for birds to save in the future. But then Jesus says, but not my will, but yours be done. And that is like the perfect prayer. Everything is possible with you. And he says, Father, everything is possible. So there's relationship, and there is power, and within that, we have a space to say, and here's what I would really like. As your child, I'm coming to you to share with you what I'd really like. And on the other hand, I give up my power and I hand over everything to you, trusting you are good. And so from that, I started summarizing that by saying, I don't know what God will do, but I know what God can do. And that's a great phrase as a pastor to be able to say, because stepping into this prayer kind of practice this healing prayer that we do a couple of times a year now. We have a healing prayer service, which terrified me in the beginning, because I thought, what if I step up as a pastor and tell my people to hope for something that doesn't happen and they're disappointed and God doesn't look great? And so it was really helpful for me to be able to say, we can tell the Lord what we want and at the same time release it. And to say, we know what God can do, but we don't know what he will do is just really healthy scriptural language, I think, to both acknowledge that anything's possible and at the same time that we don't understand how God works. And so that helps us kind of live in that in-between space that kind of includes doubt, but also kind of includes wonder.
I think anxiety always starts in the body, or at least if we can learn to notice it in our body, we can intervene quicker. So I ask every guest, does anxiety for you start in a spinning mind, a racing heart, or a tightening gut? Where would it begin for you?
That's an Enneagram question, I think.
Could be, yeah.
Yeah. I think I've always felt it in my stomach. Yeah. Butterflies and like sometimes I almost imagine they're like concrete butterflies. They're like not just little flitting pretty butterflies, it's like I'm out on the edge of a branch, on the edge of a cliff, and God is saying, scoot out a little further there, Mandy, like that kind of thing. And actually, at times when I've been in those kinds of intense periods in ministry, one time we went on vacation and we went hiking to the top of a cliff that we went to every single summer. And this one summer, I was down on all fours. I could not even walk to the edge of the cliff because that feeling in my stomach, it was only then that I realized I've already had the edge of a cliff feeling for the last year, So that's the answer to your question, I guess.
I also think one of the sources of anxiety is when we think we need something in any given moment that we don't actually need. In leadership context, what is something that you think you need in any given moment that you actually don't need?
I think it's for people to understand me entirely as a person, not just my words, but to understand me. And I think because I'm not from this country, I'm working really hard always to use American words for everything and meet them where they are. But there needs to be a way in which they also are invited to meet me where I am, and we can meet halfway kind of thing. But also because I think it helped me when I read about the INFJ business with Myers-Briggs, because it said 2% of the population are INFJs, and that actually felt really good for me to read that, because that explains why I always feel like people don't really get me. And people miscategorize, like I said earlier, if I'm in tears, it doesn't mean I've got my feelings hurt. Something else is going on. And so then I feel like it's my job to explain myself to people all the time. And, there's a way in which that's a service to them, but sometimes it's too much. And I have to trust that somehow God made us all different people, and somehow there's a way for us to figure one another out and find God in that, even if people don't fully understand me.
Well, especially if you need to be understood and someone doesn't understand you, so you use more words and then they still don't understand you, that just makes you more anxious.
It becomes an invitation, like walk with me and you'll come to understand me over time. But that takes, not everybody wants to do that or has the time to do that.
Well, and I think as a leader, you put yourself in a double bind if you always need to be understood and also are a public person. Can't have it both, right?
Yeah. Well, and it puts me in a place where I spend a lot of time rehearsing conversations beforehand or counting my words very carefully. And, we have to be responsible to that, but it can be a bit too much.
Like an obsession, yeah.
Yeah, to be thinking about all my words beforehand. It really helps me be a better writer because because I'm like editing my words constantly. But it can, in times of anxiety, that can kind of become too much. Yeah.
Third question that's always a good time for everybody. Tell us about a recent mistake you made and how you recovered from it.
Actually, it's good for me to realize I don't think about my mistakes very often. I think about my inadequacies a lot, but I guess I don't look back on my mistakes. I'm usually thinking forward to how I feel inadequate, but I don't often look back on mistakes. And maybe that's a part of the artist in me that is always thinking a mistake is an opportunity. So not that I think I do nothing wrong, but I guess with grace, I have to say, well, I guess God can work with that even if I didn't do the right thing. So maybe that's it. Maybe it's that because I'm a perfectionist, one of my big mistakes has been assuming I can't make mistakes and over stressing when I do make mistakes and over fixing and trying to like wrap up all the loose ends of every possible mistake I've ever made, which just is too much, And so maybe that's the answer is like one of the mistakes I've made is not having grace for myself in mistakes and learning to do what I can to mop up the mess, of course, and apologize where it's necessary. And at the same time, trust that all of the things I feel that need to be done to make things right after my mistake aren't necessarily allowing for God's grace.
All right, next one. The theory is that anxiety is always contagious in a group. Typically, the most anxious person in a room has the most power, unless the leader is aware of it and knows how to lead in a non-anxious way. Where have you seen anxiety be contagious in a group?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, everywhere. I was in a situation recently where a pretty intense thing suddenly got presented to the group, and the most anxious person did speak, and it became problem solving very quickly. And it also could have been an opportunity for us to stop and say, there's something sacred about this. Let's pray. Let's ask some more questions and explore this together. And instead it became a couple of hours of kind of problem solving. And it's only sometimes in hindsight that you notice that. But absolutely that did take the power in the group. And sometimes when you stop to say things like, let's pay attention, let's pray, that doesn't feel very powerful. But I believe it is.
I think especially when the people that are going into problem solving are unaware that problem solving is often an anxious response. They actually think they're de-escalating anxiety by addressing a problem, and they're unaware that very well-meaning attempt is actually escalating anxiety.
Yes. Yes. I was just listening to James Finley today, who does an amazing recording. You can buy it as an audiobook called the Thomas Merton's Path to the Palace of Nowhere. And he was, you're nodding your head, so I assume you're familiar with him.
Yeah, amazing, yeah.
Oh my goodness. And the recording is amazing because his voice is really soothing. And I sometimes fall asleep to it, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not so much. But he was actually at Gethsemane Abbey with Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton was his spiritual director, which that's going to be on my list of things to ask for when I get to heaven. So right after lunch with C.S. Lewis. Or maybe tea with C.S. Lewis would be more fitting.
Or a cigar.
Yes, although that doesn't appeal to me. He can have the cigar. I don't need the cigar.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to the question. Thomas Merton. Oh, yes. He reads a passage from Merton where Merton is in a chapel at the Abbey, and there's a bunch of flowers, and he starts by just describing the flowers, and then you can see him just kind of get lost in reality. And it's not a transcendent moment in this like amazing thing happened. He was just suddenly totally present to the reality that is at work in us all the time. And it's incredibly powerful. That's the kingdom of God. It's what Wendell Berry talks about as an economy language. And it's what Walter Brueggemann talks about when he compares empire and kingdom. And Thomas Merton talks about it in terms of uppercase reality, uppercase R reality. The recording that James Finley then adds to this quote from Thomas Merton, Finley then goes on to talk about non-activity or inactivity versus activity. And that's not passivity, but a way of choosing to set aside our own agendas in order to attend to the power that is already surging in us and around us all the time, the Spirit of God, the kingdom of God. And if we truly, this is where the real test is for me. Do I really believe that the Spirit of the God who spoke creation into existence is existing in our beings? And does he care about this more than we do? And if that's the case, paying attention to one another and to him is actually going to walk us through this problem in a more profound and meaningful way, and even probably a more so-called efficient way, a more fruitful way is a better word, than us just attending to it ourselves. And so out of my exploring that contemplative way, I've come to use language of rest, receive, respond, because the world tells you respond, respond, respond. Fix it, understand it, control it. If there's a problem, it's on you. And that is not a way of trusting that there is a spirit at work that is beyond our power or understanding. And instead, we of all people should be the most comfortable with mess and mystery. It's basically what we deal with all day, every day. With human beings and with God, it's all mess and mystery. And so we absolutely have a part to play, and we absolutely should have a response. It's not about passivity, but I watch us flipping constantly between it's all up to me and it's all up to God. And what is better and more scriptural is God inviting us into partnership. And so I think the best way for us to step into that partnership is to first rest. It's the yoke of Jesus that we set aside the world's yoke, which says respond, respond, respond. First we rest from that yoke, and then we're able to receive from whatever the Spirit has for us when we put aside our own agenda. And from that we respond. And so there is a way that we have things to do and things to say and actions to take. But the order is really important. If we start with our own response, I don't think I've seen many people who start with their own response and it's already engaging with God. So to stop and rest first feels like a waste of time, according to the world's way, according to empire. But according to kingdom ways, that's where we really tap into the true power, where we have new insight and new wisdom and new courage and new direction. And honestly, every time that I've engaged in that way individually with God or in a group with God, it has taken us to places that are so much bigger than we ever could have imagined before. And suddenly we're not just solving the problem that we thought we had. We've come to see the whole situation in a new way, and there are more opportunities and more creativity than we've ever known before. And so, yeah, I want more of that.
Yeah, one of the theories is that you've just been talking about this. You can't be attentive to your own anxiety and to the presence of God at the same time. Like our anxiety is one of the chief competitors to awareness of God. So the next two questions are really designed to help our listeners actively tap into awareness of God's, not just presence, but God's unconditional love. So Mandy, when do you feel most fully loved?
I guess it's when I'm able to set aside the things that when I'm able to see as God sees. We all have our own ideas of who we are, and they're easy to believe based on how people have treated us. And we all have our ideas of how God sees us based on some kind of warped theology or weird way that our emotions actually come into our theology. But One of my most common prayers is to just say to the Lord, help me see as you see. Help me see others as you see, and help me see myself as you see. And in those moments, that's when I'm able to choose to see the way that he sees me, which is a place of love.
What activities and places make you feel most fully alive?
I would have to say the beach, and you've probably been on some of the beaches that I'm thinking of. An Australian beach, there's nothing like it, really.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's true.
Yeah, and it's partly because things are just endless on the beach. The sky and the water just go off into nothingness, and it just seems like anything's possible because the space is unlimited. And so it feels like your imagination can be unlimited. And so I just love spaces. I try to remind myself that I live in the inner city in Cincinnati, but I love the beach, and I'm a long way from any beach. And it's not a very pretty neighborhood that I live in, but the sky is nature that is around us all the time, no matter where we are. And it's like 50% of our experience, really, from this horizon up and all the way around is sky that is nature. And even if we can't be at a beach or in a forest, it's constantly changing. It's never the same. Every day it's different. And
as a beach bum, do you need to be in the water or just close to the water is okay?
Just either is good. Yeah, I just need to be at the beach. And so I've tried to remember that same feeling that I have on the beach is still accessible to me when I'm just under the sky.
Mm-hmm. Good.
The best time is when it's the blue sky, because then you can imagine that the color of that blue is not a big blue sheet of paper wrapped over the world, but you're looking at the deepest blue of outer space that's shielded by our atmosphere. And so sometimes I just look at the sky and say, be that big in my life, in my heart, in my family, in my ministry. Be that big and beautiful. When it's cloudy, I try to just remember that's protective. And even though it's not a blue sky, clouds are protection. So
yeah, which in Cincinnati, you get lots of opportunity to celebrate that.
So I've had to remember that a lot.
Yeah, good for you.
The other thing that I think a beach does is that just I had so many hours as a child playing on the beach, and there's so many different ways you can play on the beach. You know, drawing in the sand, building with the sand, splashing in the water, finding things in rock pools. And it's just this explorative kind of space where you just are attentive and
there's a whimsy
finding
to it.
Things. Yes, finding things on the beach. And the most beautiful thing is that the contemplative experience, which has helped me set aside my anxieties, is not this, highly religious thing that is only for the most spiritual or the most old and mature. But I think children are deep contemplatives. If contemplation isn't like, I'm going to read this book and think about it until I understand it, contemplation is being attentive to the goodness that's always all around us all the time. And that means attentive to our own senses, attentive to our own emotions, attentive to our bodies, attentive to one another and to creation. Somehow on the beach, that feels easy to do. There's not a lot of other stuff going on. You're away from Facebook and traffic and all the other stuff, and you can just be attentive. And the funny thing that I've found in that kind of childlike attentiveness is that in the beginning, I imagined God was like, off you go play, I'll run the world for you. And then when you go and play in the world, you find the Lord at work. No, you find the Lord at play in his own creation.
For more, go to managingleadershipanxiety.com.
This episode has been a production of Brendan Reed and Steve Cuss.